Screws can be a DIYer's best friend or worst nightmare. Choosing the right screw for the right project can be the difference between having success and a complete failure. If you've ever started a DIY project and you started having problems, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Everything from stripped screw heads to boards that gap and everything in between. There are so many types of screws, and some screws have so many little features it can be really hard to pick the right screw. In this video, I want to go over some of the small details of screws that professionals know but DIYers might overlook. And this can be the difference between having an amazing next project and a total failure. Screws can be super confusing and very intimidating. There's no way we're going to go through every screw that you can think of in a video like this. So I thought it might be a better idea instead to just kind of look at how screws are built and talk about the small pieces of each screw so that we can understand sort of how to build the screw that we need for a specific project. Really understanding these small pieces to screws can help you pick the right fastener, whether you're trying to hang like a coat hook or maybe you're trying to build a deck. So let's jump right in and take a close look at screws. So when we take a really close-up look at a screw, we'll find that it has quite a few different pieces. The first one is the tip. When we look at screws, there are actually many very different tips to screws, and they have very unique functions. So we'll take a look at just a few of the tips that we'll find and where you might want to choose one tip over another. Then we have the threads. And the threads might seem like a fairly simple subject, but there are some extremely subtle features to threads on screws that make screws work differently. And so we'll take a look at some of those. Next we have the shank, which is basically the body of the screw. And there's some subtle things about the shanks on some screws that help it to do its job better, or they could work against you depending on your application. Next we have the head type, which would be the back side of this here. And again, there are different uses for the different types of heads. We'll take a look at some of those and help us to kind of understand when to use one over the other. Next, we have the drive type. Surely you've run into several different driver types on screws. We'll take a look at some of the common ones and kind of talk about when you might want to choose one over the other. We'll talk about finish. I think this is a subject we don't really give enough discussion to, which is like this gold color of this screw is a specific type of finish. And then maybe another one that, again, we don't talk enough about is the material that the screw is made out of. One feature that can be very helpful is a self-drilling screw. If you look really carefully at the tip of these two screws, you'll see this small cut in the shank here at the tip. And what that's designed to do is to basically try to drill its own hole before the screw goes in. And what this is designed to do is to help reduce splitting and to make the screw go through the wood a little bit easier versus one that doesn't have this. If you can, think of it kind of like a drill bit and a screw in one. These can be super helpful when you're doing something that's very repetitive and laborious, like maybe installing decking, something that would be extremely labor intensive if you were to pre-drill every single hole. And so you'll find this on a lot of different screw types. Even metal screws sometimes will have this feature if they're designed to help drill their own hole. So let's take a look at that in action. So if we take this drill bit and drill a hole, see how we get some wood shavings or wood pieces that come out as we drive the bit in there? The screw will actually do the same thing. If we look carefully as we drive the screw in, we'll see little wood shards coming out. They're very small. That is the screw trying to basically drill its own hole as it's going through. And the goal is to reduce the splitting around the screw, especially in dry wood, and to make the screw easier to drive in. Other screws won't have that self-boring feature, like this drywall screw has basically just a very pointy tip, which allows you to get straight through the sheetrock and into the framing lumber. This other screw here is a very fat tip, and it's not designed to self-bore. As you can see, there's no self-boring feature on the tip of this screw. It's something you would definitely want to pre-drill a hole for to make sure you don't get any weird splits and that the screw is not insanely difficult to install. Next, let's talk about the threads. Honestly, there could be a book written on this subject, but let's just cover some of the most basic things. There are a lot of very small features to threads. First of all, you have the pitch. So for example, on this wood screw or a decking screw, I would say that the pitch is a medium pitch. I wouldn't say it's a coarse pitch. This screw, which is more of a cabinet screw, I would say is a coarse pitch. If you look very closely, you can see that the silver screw has about 1 thread for every 2 threads on the gold screw. That means that the silver screw is going to drive even faster than the gold screw. And there's a time and a place when you want something to have a quick clamping force, and then there's a time and a place where you want something to have a slow clamping force. By comparison, this other wood screw has a very fine pitch. In fact, we can get even finer pitch than this. For example, on a machine screw where you might want to adjust something like an outlet and you want very precise control, the finer the pitch, the better. But understand that also translates to more work. A good example of where fine thread pitch is very helpful would be on this drywall anchor. For example, if you're trying to thread into a drywall anchor, like let's say you're putting in a towel rod, or maybe a toilet paper holder or something like that, or even a mirror. And you want to have really fine control over that to make sure that you get good clamping force. That's an example of where fine thread pitch would be really helpful. But if you're trying to get a lot of work done, as in the case of trying to build cabinets, or maybe you're trying to build a deck and you need to get some work done, you want to make sure that you're moving toward a more coarse thread pitch. Odds are also pretty good. If you're driving these 2 types of screws, you're probably going through wood, and wood can be fairly forgiving because of grain compression. Once the screw is fully inserted, you can squish the grain just a little bit, which gives you some forgiveness. And so having a screw that's not very precise isn't the end of the world. But if you're trying to work on something that maybe is like glass, like a mirror, or is metal, it's pretty important that we don't over tighten that screw and we create a blemish, maybe break the mirror or damage the metal. And so having fine control is very helpful. So a practical application of this is looking at all 4 of these screws. They will all be sold as wood screws. But you can see that the screw over here has a very coarse thread pitch, where the next one has a fine thread pitch. And then again, coarse thread pitch, and then sort of a medium thread pitch. Really think about the project that you're trying to do, and because you're going to be buying screws anyway, choose the one that fits your project the best. If you're enjoying this video and you want more DIY content, please take a moment and subscribe. And if you know of somebody who's a really hardcore DIYer who might benefit from this, please give it a share. Next, let's talk about the shank. That's just the body of the screw, and while it seems like a simple subject, there could be a whole book written on this. Let's just take a look at some of the basic things that you can think about when you're choosing a screw for your next project. So probably the first and most obvious feature is the size of the screw. Some of the most common sizes that you'll find in screws are number 8, number 9, and number 10. And choosing these carefully will save you money and also reduce some of the labor if it's not necessary to have a heavier screw. You might think about whether a screw is being used in the vertical orientation for its clamping force, or whether it's being used kind of laterally and there's an amount of shear load on it, like maybe you're trying to hang something off of the screw. That might help you to choose a heavier or a lighter duty screw. The reality is when we use a screw in the vertical orientation, it's not really under any side load at all. And so the body of the screw doesn't need to be so strong. But when we try to hang something with a screw, we would want to make sure that the screw is strong enough to hold that load that's trying to break the screw in half, or a shear load. The next thing to think about is this small blank spot here, or smooth area of the shank. Some screws have this, while other screws do not. This is actually a feature. It's not that the company was lazy and didn't want to pay to put threads all the way to the top of the screw. It's actually designed to help you with your project. So in the case of a screw that does not have this, you're going to get threads all the way to the top, and it's going to clamp all the way to the top. The problem is if you're trying to fasten 2 pieces of wood and there's any gap between the wood at all, the gap will not be able to close itself, because there's too many threads and neither piece of wood can move. And so in this situation, you would want to make sure that the wood is firmly clamped together. That way, as the screw leaves one piece of wood and goes into the other, you end up with a tight joint. Any gaps, and this screw will simply maintain the gap, which could be very frustrating. And that's where a screw like this comes in super handy. So as the threads leave the first piece of wood and they enter the second piece of the wood, there are no more threads behind it. So essentially there's just a hole in the upper piece of wood. And therefore, the screw can move freely through the body of the wood and can provide clamping force and bring the two pieces of wood together tightly. This is very, very helpful when you don't have the ability to clamp something, like on decking, for example. You can get a screw with almost any length of unthreaded throat. So if you need a screw for your next project that provides clamping force where you're not able to clamp, look for a screw that has a smooth shank on it, and that will help you by pulling the two pieces that you're trying to fasten together. It's worth pointing out a very subtle difference between these two screws, which effectively are both wood screws. They're both the same length. They both have about the same thread pitch. They both have the same head on them, and they're the same drive type. But notice that the shank is ever so slightly different between these two. Notice this one has a much longer smooth section than this one. So if you accidentally were to buy this screw and hope that it would pull two boards together, you would be wrong. And it's going to drive you nuts on your next project. You want to be very careful when looking at the subtle details, because this long, smooth shank really does provide an extra clamping force, where this one, even though it has many of the same features, will provide almost no clamping force. It's just a fastener. And one last feature to talk about in the body of the screw is this small area just above the threads. You'll see this in a lot of different orientations on different screws. For example, these two screws have something very similar here just above the threads. This is reverse fluting. And again, it's meant to help the head sink tightly into whatever you're fastening by boring a little bit larger hole, bigger than the threads, after the threads have gone through, and that allows the head to sink in without tearing out or smashing the grain. This is really helpful when you're trying to sink a screw into wood, when you want the head to actually penetrate or be flush, and you don't want to pre-drill. So now let's take a look at the head, and there are many different types of heads, so we're just going to look at maybe the three most common that you'll run into. This screw has what's called a flat head. These screws are meant to be driven all the way into the wood so that the head is flush or even slightly recessed from the surface. So you would use this in an application where you would not want the screw to stick up above whatever you're fastening. A flathead screw has an excellent clamping force, but there's one small caveat to that. You'll notice that the head is shaped somewhat like a wedge. That's obviously meant to help spread the wood fibers out in this case so that the head has room to recess itself. So these can, in some cases, induce splitting or extra splitting force. So if you're using them in dry wood or near the edge of a piece of wood, you're going to find that these are going to want to split the wood. I'm going to share a trick at the end of the video that can help you to minimize that splitting force of a flathead screw, so stay tuned for that. And then we have another common head type called a truss head. So this does not have a taper on the bottom. Instead, the bottom is very, very flat. In fact, it's so flat it's very wide, and it's designed to have extra clamping force when you're trying to pull something very tightly together. The one trade-off there, though, is that the head will stick out. In this case, this is a pocket screw, and we want an exceptional amount of directional clamping force, and we don't really care about the head because it's hidden inside the wood. In a lot of cases, you're going to pre-drill for these types of heads to make sure that they are recessed or hidden, but you're buying them because you want the extra surface area that comes with the truss head screw, because it provides extra clamping force and it has no real appreciable difference on the splitting effect of the screw. So if you want extra holding power, no splitting, but you don't mind pre-drilling, a truss head screw is going to be great. And finally, what we call a pan head. It basically sticks up above the surface just like the truss head screw, except for the head is quite a bit smaller, and in some cases these are more of a decorative screw. Not always, but they're used in applications where it's okay if the head sticks above the surface and you don't need the extra clamping force of the truss head, and in this case the threads go all the way up to the head. So this is probably going to be something you're going to use like in a drywall anchor or something like that that's pre-drilled, and you just need a fastener to connect everything together. One last screw head I want to mention, just in case someone will be working on this type of work, is what's called a trim head. It's actually a very compact little head. It's basically the same concepts we've discussed earlier, but you'll notice it's very compact, and that's meant to just sink in quietly and make the least amount of impact when using it. So if you're looking for something that has a very small footprint in the head and obviously doesn't have as much holding power, give the trim head a look. I won't go into detail in this video, but I'll just mention that this has a counter screw at the top of it, which is not fluting. This actually has a completely different function of making this screw adjustable. Once you drive it through the trim, you can actually use the screw itself to adjust the trim. So if you're looking for something like this, take a look at the trim screw. And now we have a topic that's probably one of the most debated topics in all of fasteners, which is the drive type. And yes, you can get the same screw in nearly every single drive type. My observation is that people over time kind of develop a preference, and their toolbox looks like that. So they end up with a specific type. And so if you're trying to find a screw for your project and everything you have available to you is not your preferred drive type, you just need to look around. And a lot of times you'll find exactly the screw that you need in the drive type that you like. So let's talk about some of these. So we've got the standard or slotted screw. Sometimes they're used in something like a drywall anchor where there's not really a lot of drilling force so much, it's more the clamping force that we're after. And so just the girth of this screw alone, if you were to try to put it into wood with a slotted screwdriver, a lot of times will just cam out or just, strip out the head. And if you've ever tried that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Next, we have the Phillips head. This one's been around for a very long time, and a lot of people are very familiar with it, and it has a pretty good holding power. There is one thing that gets people in trouble with this. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But this is a very good screw head if you have the tooling for it and you understand how it works and you don't overload the head. Then we have square. Square is something that's fairly new, but it actually is a very well-performing screw, and we really like to use that in our decking screws. We have a very high success rate because we use a screw gun. That bit engages the screw very well over something like a Torx bit, which tends to have a rounding effect on the bit over time, where the square seems to maintain the bit integrity better. And finally, we have the Torx bit, which is again, the very popular drive type. This is something that's been around for quite a while now and has an amazing ability to maintain the bit integrity and not strip out. In fact, with the Torx, the heads are so good, a lot of times you can take them out and put them in several times and the head will still be in great condition. Next, let's take a look at finishes. So screws obviously come in many different finishes. It doesn't really matter necessarily what the underlying screw is made out of. It's more the coating that's put on it for different applications. So this drywall screw, for example, if you've ever put these in sheetrock, just the moisture from the taping and mudding process will often make them rust. They have a very light oxide coating on them, and it is not meant to deal with persistent moisture. It'll deal with a little bit for a second, but man, do they rust quickly. So certainly in an application where rust would be bad for visual purposes or structural integrity, can you imagine the screw just rotting out completely and then whatever you built falling apart? That's why you wouldn't want to use something like this in an exterior application. And the container will tell you whether something is designed for exterior use. Something else that gets people in trouble is using these types of screws with pressure-treated wood. Pressure-treated wood is very unique because of the chemicals that they use to treat the wood, and it has sort of a persistent moisture content in it. So using a screw like this that has no finish, this screw will literally rust out over time, and whatever you built is going to fall apart. Other finishes include something like a painted finish, like this green screw has an exterior coating on it. And that obviously helps the screw have a lot more integrity, but it also helps the screw to drive easier. It's somewhat smoother than other coatings, and so it has a way of sort of making the screw easier to put in. And that brings us maybe to the last point to talk about, which is what is the screw made out of? So this shiny screw doesn't actually have a coating on it. It's made out of stainless steel. So the entire screw is a different metal than this wood decking screw. This stainless steel screw is basically impervious to moisture and chemicals. So for example, we built a wood-fired hot tub. This is a chemical exposure environment. And so even though the wood screw has all these coatings and things on it to help it in a wet environment, my fear was that using something like this, over time, the chemicals would attack the screw. And so we opted to use a stainless steel screw in that application. Pretty amazing how many little details go into a screw, isn't there? But I'll tell you what, paying attention to those small details has really changed my projects and made them a lot more enjoyable. And I'll tell you, when you get the right screw, wow, it's an amazing feeling. But when you get the wrong screw, man, we're right back into that angry type of project, if you know what I'm talking about. Two other things that I want to share that a lot of DIYers get wrong. The first one is knowing when to use a drill versus an impact. Using the wrong driver can really alter the ability of a screw to do its job. Sometimes using an impact makes a lot of sense, for example, in drilling a deck screw, because you have a lot of force, you're trying to bring two pieces of wood together, and the impact has a way of reducing the fatigue on the person, especially after hundreds or even thousands of repetitions. But there are times where using a drill is actually a superior option. For example, let's say that you're installing something around tile and you're trying to put a screw in very carefully. It is a notorious mistake to use an impact driver, which has a horrible reputation of breaking tile. And I'll tell you, if there's nothing more frustrating, it's when you're trying to get a small project done and all you end up doing is making more work for yourself. And finally, I think maybe one of the more common DIY mistakes is not having the right bit for what you're trying to do. It's amazing how having the wrong bit can work for just a minute and then all of a sudden it all falls apart. A lot of times the bit will actually get damaged after a couple of rough attempts, and then after that it just wants to damage the screw. If you don't already have something like this, a lot of the major brands sell a small variety of drill bits. You can always reach for the right driver when you need it. It really does make a big difference, because a lot of times there's nothing wrong with the screw, but when you try to use the wrong bit, it's just going to cause you problems. If you're not really sure which bit should be used with your screws, try to look on the packaging if it has some, and a lot of times it'll tell you right on the packaging, this is a T20 bit, or a number 2 Phillips, or a number 2 square bit. And that way you can reach for your bit kit and you can grab the right bit and then you're good to go. Sometimes you get really lucky and the company includes the bit for the screw in the package. Drilling and countersinking is something that's always frustrated me as a DIYer, but I discovered a really powerful tool that makes this process very easy. DeWalt makes this really helpful tool if you're going to regularly pre-drill and even countersink your screws. This tool is a drill bit and a driver bit in one, and it's a quick release mechanism. You simply remove this, and hidden inside is both a drill bit with a countersink and a driver bit, and this is interchangeable. There's a small Allen set screw here, and you can switch this out for whatever your preferred drive screw is. These are replaceable, so if they break or get damaged over time, you can simply replace them, and you can see how this could speed up doing fine screw work. If you're going to be doing some regular drilling and countersinking, give this tool a look. I think you're going to fall in love. Wow, that was fun. We got through a lot of really fun little details about screws. So I'm curious, what are the little things that you have found about screws that have changed your DIY projects? Drop them in the comments below and we'll all learn together. Thanks for joining me for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.